I mean, like I've heard like Chris Gore talk about this kind of stuff recently about like movie length and stuff, like
Yeah.
being over 2 hours, and I understand that as well. And then there's streaming, and when they try to make movies and shows for streaming, but it's like, should the goal for films or like filmmakers to make a film for the theater or for when you take it home? Because it's only in the theater for the least amount of time compared to when you own it, right? And I guess that's
There's
where
like
I've been confused on
three
how
different eras of that, really, Rook, or actually kind of like four. Because when movies first started, they would basically have their first run, and unless they were like a Gone with the Wind or a Wizard of Oz or something like that that had evergreen value, that's where a lot of those movies we were talking about earlier that just kind of got lost to time. Some of them were revived with television because television needed stuff to show, so they would buy the old movies, and so a lot of people fell in love with those. In fact, you had movies like Night of the Living Dead and It's a Wonderful Life that are so well beloved today, mainly because they fell into the public domain for whatever reason it was because of the copyright. So smaller television stations would show them all the time. So it was just one of those things where, especially back then, that's the other thing I think kids nowadays, I mean, you kind of understand it because you grew up in the 90s, but I still don't think even somebody growing up in the 90s could grasp only having like 3 channels.
Yeah.
Only having like a handful of channels to watch.
My dad's house had like a few channels, and then I had a little more.
Unless you grew up in the country, then I could understand. Yeah, if you had an antenna and you know what that's kind of like, then that's kind of the closest that you could understand to what it was kind of like growing up back then. Because even HBO and Cinemax, if you were lucky enough to have those kind of things in your area, right, even those were a luxury because they were $12, $15, $20 a month back then. And you got to go with inflation. That's almost like $150 to $100 nowadays. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So we bitch about the price of streaming services. We really don't have a room to bitch. Because when video finally came along, because that was the thing. So a lot of that stuff got lost. And then videotape came along with, they tried different ways of trying to bring movies home. HBO and home video started right around the same time. And HBO was this first time idea where you could actually watch movies at home that were uncut, no commercials, because that was the only other way you could see a movie before that, again, is unless you caught a revival once in a while, which did happen more often back then. So don't get me wrong. It wasn't like bigger movies that were well known. Like I said, the more evergreen films would get re-released quite more often. They would get shown on television, and that was a big deal because, like CBS would have the network premiere of whatever big movie was, or Psycho, And then the thing is they would go around and, like, even at that time when Psycho showed on television, they re-released it in theaters not shortly thereafter, and with Hitchcock even saying in the trailers, "See what they didn't dare show you in the TV."
Yeah.
And it would, and the other side of that, where sometimes you get these other guys that would get smart, and they would cram a bunch of scenes back into the movie that got cut out and drag the movie out for 2 nights. So they get basically twice the money for it. And these were lucrative deals for the studios at the time. So, for instance, King Kong 1976 showed over 2 nights. Superman the movie showed over 2 nights.
How long were those films typically?
They were like 220 or whatever in the theaters, but then when they would do the extended cuts on television, they would run about 3 hours because a 90-minute block is 2 hours of television back then.
Right.
So like a 90-minute movie would fit perfectly into 2 hours. And that's the thing, and that was kind of what I was getting to, is running time was dictated largely by a film costs more money the longer it is. Period. And if you're doing film prints, the more prints you got to do, the more it's going to cost if that film's longer. So they kind of had this thing in Hollywood where family films clocked in about 70 minutes at tops, 80 minutes if you're really pushing it. Disney got a little bit, with their live action movies, they get a little over that. But like an animated film, you'd never see over 60, 70 some minutes. You know what I'm saying? Comedies always clocked in under 90 minutes.
Yeah, those I'd say that's about perfect.
Action, mystery, thrillers always clocked in around 90 to an hour 45, 2 hours if it was a real, dramatic piece. But very rarely would you have your Gone with the Winds, right? That is a very rare thing. Even Coppola had to fight tooth and nail to get Godfather released in a 3-hour version. Because the studios back then didn't want to do that. Didn't want to release those longer movies. Sorry.
Yeah, going with that, I mean, do you think that even nowadays there should be more of a restriction on longer films that are like over 2.5 hours? Like,
yeah, unless you're a trusted person, yes.
Like to have it really be like, is the value worth it being this long? Can you get the main course of your story done without it being this long? And then in a way, does that add value to the physical copy where, well, there is technically more, and if you want to see more of it, you have the whole main story here in the theater, but here's the extended. I mean, I look at Lord of the Rings.
Well, that's kind of what they did is they took that idea of putting the longer version on TV into the unrated and director's cuts on home video. Is what happened down the road,
because like after I realized that the theatrical versions of the Lord of the Rings, they had extendeds. I only saw the extended versions within the last couple of years, guys. Like I can't go back to watch the original like theater version. I have to see the really long versions because they're really good. Like
and that's another rarity though, Rook, because if you'll start learning as over time if you start watching like the theatrical cut and watching the director's cut of a lot of movies, outside of a few rare exceptions. 9 times out of 10, there's a reason that shit was cut out.
Well, I thought Dodgeball directors are extended cut a little bit. They only have like a few extra scenes and moments.
And that comes from the unrated era.
The extended version is dumber to me because it was like showing scenes that weren't as funny when they were like if they're cut, it makes some scenes funnier. But you have it you had
them actually doing that on purpose, Rook, at that time. See, that was the thing. Prior to that, you would shoot a movie. You would sit down in the editing bay. You know, they always say you make a movie 3 times in the writing process, the shoot it, and then you edit it. That's the 3 times you make the movie, and each time it's like a different movie. Because once you get to the editing bay, what you thought was the most important scene in the script might be the least important scene by the time you get to the editing side of things.
I got you.
So like when but in the 2000s, like Fox, the reason you had unrated of every one of these movies back then, Fox mandated that. Because it was a way of selling extra DVDs.
Yeah. And there would only be like 2 or 4 minutes long, extra long minutes.
Yeah, it was on purpose. And it was like, okay, do your R-rated cut, but just remember when we go to theaters, it's going to be PG-13.
Sort of to do it like that. Oh, man.
Because they get more views with PG-13 than you get the kids in. So the
a few rare exceptions.
They get collectors that want every version, right? Or something.
Well, right. And I don't mind having a bunch of different versions of a movie. I love it. But my main issue is don't make that the only version available.
Exactly. And that's what they do with streaming. That's what they do with streaming.
George Lucas made it where you can only get the newest version. And I bought the DVDs and I was like, what the hell is this? This was the first time I experienced what you guys did for many years, I assume,